All right, let's get started for today. It is 2/2/22, which is kind of fun. We're now in a new month, and hopefully things are moving pretty smoothly for you as February continues. I know this has been a busy time of year for a lot of folks who are getting in things like scholarships, competition, applications for various events or jobs, or you're a senior, right? Career opportunities after that. I know I've definitely made this a chaotic time of year, but I appreciate all of your hard work and engagement so far. And I'm excited to continue our discussion surrounding some of the core ideas about rhetorical listening, the ways that communication and listening connect to the history and context of rhetoric. So last class, we spent some time talking about the first major essay assignment for the course. Again, since this is a 300 level course, the writing requirement is a little bit higher than other classes. So we talked a little bit about what to expect for this assignment, the details related to that assignment and so on. We'll do a quick recap about that in just a minute. We also talked about some of the major goals of rhetorical listening, right? So last week, we were talking a little bit about what it means to listen professionally. Now we're applying some of these ideas in the context of issues like culture, gender, and so on. And then we thought about what those skills of rhetorical listening look like. So for those of you that have taken a class related to rhetoric or rhetorical issues, this is probably a little bit of a review, right? But last class was an opportunity to explore and understand what rhetoric is, what matters to things to communication, listening, and how it connects to the core ideas presented in this week's reading. So essay 1 is due on February 13th. That's not this coming Sunday, the following Sunday. Again, I wanted to post and have the prompt available to give you at least 2 weeks to think through and to start to develop this essay. If you go to Canvas, the prompt is available for this assignment, just like for the listening assessment that you did earlier in the quarter. The assignment should be 4 pages, double spaced, standard font margins, and then works cited as well. This first essay, again, is asking you to pick from 3 different prompts that are available that look at some of the different applications and ways that we use listening. For instance, listening in professional settings, listening as it applies to interpersonal, one-on-one communication, and then a prompt related to communication and media. You can choose which of those 3 prompts you find the most interesting or you'd most like to explore and work through. Again, I'm happy to look at rough draft, outlines, or meet with you in an office hour session to help you with preparing and working through this assignment. It's a way to sort of apply and test the things that you've been working on and learning so far in the class. I also wanted to make a mention with regard to the listening assessment assignment that you've completed. So my goal is to have feedback to you by the end of the day on Friday. There are still a couple of folks that haven't had the chance to turn in that assignment yet. So if you have not turned it in and you're planning to use your get out of jail free card, just let me know. Remember, if you turn it in by the end of the day today with the get out of jail free card, you can do so without a penalty. And if you don't use the card, right, it's minus 5% for each day that something is late. So if you turn it in, right, today, that would be minus 35%. So just wanted to keep you updated on that. And again, I like to use feedback with some of these earlier assignments to help you to know what to do and to continue to work on for some of those later essays too. So please use the feedback that you'll receive as a way to help you in preparing and brainstorming and figuring out this first essay. Last class on Monday, we talked a little bit about rhetoric, right? Rhetoric dates back to Greeks, to folks such as Aristotle, right? And rhetoric is about the way that we use persuasion. Rhetoric is not just concerned with something being interesting. You read a book and you think, that was kind of fun. Or you watch a show and you enjoy yourself. It's more about how the messages that we have every single day in our lives can influence, can persuade, can move us. And it's more than just the ways that we hear something like a big fancy formal speech, right? There are actually a lot of times when it's not very persuasive. It's about the ways that we have advertisements, the ways that algorithms target us and we start talking about wanting Cheetos, and all of a sudden we get ads on social media trying to get us to buy Cheetos, right? It's about the ways that we use things such as social media in order to persuade and influence and convince one another, right? So rhetoric is an especially important way to think about listening because it helps us to understand how we make sense of and engage with persuasive messages. Additionally, right, we talked about the ways that rhetoric is connected to a lot of major social and cultural issues. We look at things such as social movements and social activism, the way that there have been protests in a lot of different social and cultural issues, and the ways those have connected pretty deeply to issues of race, identity, gender, and a lot of different elements of culture, right? In this way, again, rhetoric provides us with a tool set to understand how we can listen to messages and use them toward issues and topics we find important. We also introduced Krista Ratcliffe's approach to rhetorical listening. Again, rhetorical listening, as she suggests, is a trope, right, or a style of invention, specifically interpretive invention. The idea that through listening, we interpret and again make sense of a message, and through that interpretation and way that we understand and pick up on a message, we've created something entirely different. That yes, we hear a message, we hear that that message has been received, but the way that that message resonates and makes sense for us operates in a way of independent of the authorial or writer intent. How many folks have ever heard the phrase death of the author? Sounds like it might be kind of new for folks. So this comes from a linguist, cultural theorist, Roland Barthes. Barthes has this idea, right, a famous essay that talks about the idea that we have experienced the death of the author and the birth of the reader, right? That is that things such as authorial intent don't necessarily matter. If you have written a book or created a show or created a movie, right? It's out of your hands and you can do whatever you want to say what your intention or goal of that is, right? But the way that people watch or read or pick up on it could be read in a very, very different way. That the way that you read and understand and pick up on the message is a lot more important than what the original author was trying to get across or to share. For instance, there's a lot of examples, classic literature, films, right, television, and so on, that gain a cult following, right, or gain support or interest that goes beyond the initial release or initial intention of that piece. We oftentimes will see shows, movies, and so on that get reappropriated or used in different settings. So this idea is important because we can think about how we listen as something that exists independent of the message itself. What stands out to us or interests us is not necessarily what the author was trying to do. So these are important considerations, right, when we think about the ways that identity impacts our communication. So for this class, I want to really try to unpack and understand what rhetorical listening is. And in order to do so, we need to understand some of the key ideas that Ratcliffe is bringing to the table that inform rhetorical listening as an approach, and then some of the challenges and issues that can prevent us from engaging in that effectively. We spent a lot of class last time using setup, and I want to use some time for today to talk about what rhetorical listening really is. And again, the Ratcliffe piece is a little bit of a denser read. Some of the ideas and perspectives that she brings to the table might be ideas that you're not familiar with, right? And I want to use some time to bring in a better understanding of the ideas she's drawing from. And again, right, you might not necessarily agree with all of the claims or arguments or ideas that Ratcliffe brings to the table, and that's okay, right? A lot of the way that we can approach and think about readings is not to say that it's gospel or what everybody should do and adhere to, but instead to suggest that it's a framework for understanding and sort of realizing the author's perspective. So one way to help is in a lot of these articles, again, that are more dense or academically focused, right? Oftentimes there's some type of overview or preview that goes over the main ideas or things that the author intends to cover. So if you're ever going through an article like this that feels a little bit more challenging or difficult to follow, I really recommend searching for that preview or roadmap, because that can help the rest of your reading flow a lot better. For Ratcliffe, there's a few major goals of this piece. First is to trace rhetorical listening. What is it, and how can we understand it in a historical way, looking at the past? Biases related to listening and speaking. That's an important idea because Ratcliffe brings in, as we'll talk about in a minute, the idea that we oftentimes correlate oral communication, something that's said verbally, right, to listening, but we'll correlate correlate written communication to reading, right? And the distinction between reading and listening, as we talked a little bit about in week 3 on media, is an important consideration. Also, Ratcliffe suggests why listening is important, and why it matters, and is a distinction with a difference compared to something like reading. The definition of rhetorical listening is what she does next. Its application to cross-cultural conduct, that is, the ways that we communicate and engage in different cultures. And then applications, ways to use rhetorical listening. So she uses an extended example where she talks about a story that's shared by one of her students. Cross-cultural communication is a useful and helpful thing to think about. You might be familiar, if you've taken a class of interpersonal or intercultural, with this idea of intercultural communication. This refers to the idea that we communicate and work with members of different cultures. It's very similar to the idea of cross-cultural communication, that we are crossing over, right, or relating to or communicating with people that occupy very different senses of cultural experience and identity. Again, what culture means to us and what our culture is not as simple as things such as our nationality or our country of origin or a race, right? Culture covers a lot of different elements and combinations of things that make us who we are. So it's important to think about culture as being this very large in many ways intersectional, crossing over elements of identity. So I do want to go over some core assumptions or ideas that are related to what Ratcliffe is saying regarding listening. One of the key ideas here is the idea of something being gendered, right? So some of you who have maybe taken classes in anthropology, sociology, or similar areas might be familiar with courses related to gender studies or the examination of gender, right? And how gender works. Gender is a doing, right? Gender refers to the performance through things such as clothing, mannerisms, behavior, and so on that we associate with a particular gender identity, right? In other words, there's nothing that says inherently that playing football or playing with dolls, right, is inherently masculine or feminine. It's that culture has associated and sorted those categories into definitions of what it means to be masculine, feminine, anywhere in between or outside of those categories too, right? So when we say something is gendered, we say that it has been sorted into or categorized on the basis of gender identity. Not that it's a, that it objectively or hard-coded DNA is one or the other. A really good example of thinking about this is blankets, right? Oftentimes when a newborn is, brought into this world, they are wrapped in a blanket, or they maybe have tags, or even balloons, right? And oftentimes we'll associate blue, the color blue, with folks that are assigned male at birth, and pink with people assigned female at birth, right? There's no reason that blue is masculine or pink is feminine. Like there's nothing that says if we really follow it along, that one thing is masculine, one thing is feminine. There's no there, right? There's no like little hidden, when we see the color blue, it doesn't flash before our eyes that that's masculine or feminine. Instead, that's something that culture, including a lot of the ways that culture has viewed gender, has been created over time, that we've come to associate through the constant performance and doing of gender as blue is masculine, pink is feminine, right? And obviously, there's a lot of different ways that gender and what is gender in particular ways is changed, is played with, right? Gender is something that we're constantly playing or experimenting or performing with. And historically, in terms of culture, in terms of time, and so on, right, those definitions really tend to change. For instance, we've seen a lot more in the context of celebrities and prominent figures who have challenged or played or engaged with how we commonly think about gender, right? So something being gendered means that we assign or categorize it on the basis of gender, like a pink or blue light. In other words, if we draw from that assumption, the idea that things can be gendered, typically we would associate and have associated historically, according to Ratcliffe, the idea that speaking is seen as more masculine. There's a lot of different ways to trace this. For instance, perhaps, right, men have more often had opportunity or availability to speak. There might be ways that speaking is associated more with action or other things that we might see as or associate as masculine. And historically, over time, listening has been associated as a more feminine trait or behavior, right? Not to suggest that any of those things are inherently masculine or feminine, but that oftentimes they're culturally coded or interpreted as such. In other words, then, we think about that, then we also can think about the ways that feedback or responses to questions that we might give through the listening process could also be different, right? In many ways, for instance, in a masculine context, questions or feedback could be more in terms of have I won or versus or feminine types of questions might be associated with being helpful or contributing to participation. Again, not to associate any of those things as inherently masculine or feminine, but to say that society is oftentimes coded our feedback in response to questions in different ways. So, right, with that in mind, those divides mean that oftentimes listening is undervalued, or when listening is valued, it's valued in a very kind of gendered context. You might be more willing to say to somebody that is categorized or resigned as feminine that they are a good listener in a way that we wouldn't in a masculine way, right? So that's an important consideration is if we divide up who we think is listening versus speaking, then we're going to have some challenges about the ability to listen effectively across a variety of gender identities, right? Another challenge, right? And again, I know the issues surrounding race can be very heated and very challenging to think about, right? I think it's important to always take a step back and reflect. For instance, right? I'm somebody who's white and somebody that is constantly trying to learn and to better understand and to empathize with perspectives of individuals from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds, with the knowledge that I firsthand am not going to be able to embody or firsthand understand those experiences, right? That you can listen and you can try to understand, empathize to do better, while also never truly being in different shoes than the ones that you occupy, right? A core idea that Ratcliffe brings to the table is in a discussion of whiteness, right? And this is not to suggest that being white means that you're a bad person, right? That's not the claim here. The claim here is that whiteness is a strategy or a tactic that oftentimes gets used. For instance, right, oftentimes in a lot of societies or cultures, whiteness or being white is the taken for granted or the default, right? That's a quote unquote normal person. which is not the case if we look internationally. We know, right, that we have huge swaths of the population across the globe that are not white. So the idea then, being white is normal or is taken for granted or is be given, is what Ratcliffe is referring to when she's talking about whiteness. Not to suggest that it's bad to be white, but to suggest that on that basis, right, if we assume that that's the normal, if, for instance, we're looking at somebody's job application and we see their name and we assume that they're a white person, that we risk erasing elements of their culture, identity, experiences, and so on. That we hide issues of racism and marginalization under this blanketed approach to thinking about communication. In other words, right, rhetorical listening provides us with a framework to consider and to understand how whiteness implicates listening and the listening process. For instance, right, for folks that are white, rhetorical listening is a way to account for and think about blind spots. There's an excellent speech that a champion in formative speaking did at the National High School Tournament, where she talks about the issue and topics surrounding Black hair, right? For a lot of folks that come from, again, diverse racial backgrounds, right? She talks about how when she goes to a hotel and tries to use the shampoo there, that the shampoo is not a good fit for her. It doesn't account for the way that her hair curls, changes, and so on, right? So this is an example of how sort of taken for granted default, oh, here's shampoo, and not recognizing the ways that race impacts how shampoo is able to be used is an example, right, of how rhetorical listening can help us better understand these issues. Pictured here on the right is Thomas Nakayama, who is one of the key authors in Whiteness, Strategic Rhetoric, who is drawing from and theorizing this idea. Again, listening helps us to consider how things like race impact what we're using to think about conversations, other topics, and other issues, right? It lets us become more sensitive and thoughtful to what's hidden beneath the surface or not necessarily talked about when we're dealing with certain social or political topics. Another key idea here is the idea that Ratcliffe brings in regarding identification. So to say, I identify as X or I identify with Y is an important idea. Pictured here on the right is Kenneth Burke, who was a core theorist and scholar related to rhetoric and identification. So think about something like a book, TV show, movie, some form of media that you've engaged with recently. There's a good chance that that media contains a character that's a protagonist, right? Or somebody that you find yourself putting, you're in their shoes, right? Or you relate to them. That's identification. Identification deals with the idea that we have commonality or similarity to someone or something else, and that based on that commonality, we're able to be persuaded by that person. We're a lot more likely to listen to a friend who tells us that we should go check out a new restaurant, right? Because we relate to that friend, we've spent a lot of time with them, and so on. Total stranger says go to this restaurant, we're probably not going to because we don't trust them or know them or understand them. So our ability to relate to other people is a core way that we become persuaded or influenced by other people. Again, there's a lot of ways that main characters are presented as relatable or empathetic so that we care about and feel like we're a part of their journey, right? So for instance, right, that the movie Encanto recently came out. I watched it on Disney Plus, and there were a lot of young girls, right, who find Mirabel's character to be really interesting, relatable, fun, and similar to that, particularly students from and children from diverse backgrounds, right? It's an example of how identification can be a powerful and meaningful tool. by finding people and experiences that we consider to be relatable. Another idea that Ratcliffe uses as a part of the argument that I think is worth unpacking and thinking about a little bit more as well is ocular centrism. Ocular centrism deals with the idea that we are a very vision-focused and vision-centered society. For instance, let's think about some of the metaphors that we use that relate to visioning. I see, or I see you. I'm looking at you. I'll keep my eyes peeled. Right? We use a lot of different types of metaphors and examples that relate to sight and relate to vision as a way of conveying our society. We go driving in a car, and obviously in order to do that, right, we have to account for visual elements. One example, if you've seen the Netflix show Daredevil, right, the main character is blind, but the way they depict his senses is very kind of visually focused. It kind of looks like if you're doing something like an ultrasound where you see like the different levels of shapes and so on, right? And that's still an example of the way that vision governs a lot of the ways that we express ourselves in structure society, right? That for folks that might be blind, it's a lot more challenging to navigate this world because we've created a world that's very focused on our ability to see, right? So that's an interesting idea on its own. The ways that we use sight, probably in a way that matters more than a lot of other senses, but it matters in the context of listening for a couple of reasons. One of them is that if we associate a written text or written document with sight, then that means that we are not listening, we're reading. Right? Eyesight corresponds to reading, sound in our ears correspond to listening. If that's the case, it's a lot harder for us to think about what it means to listen to something that involves using our eyes. So challenging our privileging of sight, and instead thinking about how something we see is also something we listen to is a core idea here that Ratcliffe brings in as well. So in order to make her core argument, Ratcliffe is making three major steps regarding rhetorical listening, what it is and how it works. The first step is the idea that rhetorical listening, quote, promotes an understanding of ourselves and others in forms of politics and ethics. Again, we're going to break down each of these parts in a little bit more detail. Secondarily, the idea that rhetorical listening creates responsibility rather than a defensive approach. That's an important idea too. And then lastly, to locate identification, thinking back to Kenneth Burke and what we just mentioned earlier, in discursive or communication-oriented spaces, where we're able to find commonalities and differences, but allow those differences to impact how we understand culture, cultural logic. So we'll break down each of those three parts in a little bit more detail to understand how they connect to the overall argument. But these three core steps are at the heart of what rhetorical listening is or could be. The first step, right, is that we understand ourselves and other people that inform our culture, politics, and ethics. So let's break that down. Knowing or understanding yourself, right? Know thyself is something that we could think about in a lot of different components. Again, the idea of something like intersectionality is the idea that we are not just one thing, right? We are not just something like a gender or race or disability and so on. We are a combination or intersection where a lot of different lines crossing over together, and that combination makes us who we are, right? That cultural background, again, includes things like gender, race, sexuality, sexual orientation, class, disability, nationality, and right? Knowing ourselves means thinking about all of those elements to make us who we are. So to say, for instance, I'm white, I'm a person with a disability, I'm socioeconomically stable, so on. I was born in the United States. That combination of things is important to think about. I find that oftentimes when we have like culture wars or arguments or debate or disagreement with other people from different backgrounds as us, the one challenge that comes is our inability to really think about these things in a holistic way, right? Is to think about how, yes, right, I might be somebody who is experiencing economic insecurity, poverty, and things such as my gender or race are also impacting how these issues affect. So knowing yourself is important, right? It's also important for us to understand others, right? And where they're coming from. It can be easy for us to rush to stereotypes or judgments about other people. So really taking the time to understand and think about where somebody else is coming from is an important idea too. And that the combination of knowing ourselves and knowing other people shapes our politics and ethics. You can think about politics in terms of structure. How are our lives structured? How is things such as governmental organization and group structured, right? Politics being the way that we use and allocate power. And ethics. Ethics deals with what we should or shouldn't do. The idea of what's right or wrong. For instance, it is ethical to work on an assignment or paper for a class independently and to cite your sources, right? Would be an example of how we think about ethics in politics. So who we are and who other people are and how we understand our relationships are implicated by the way that power is used. For instance, the way power impacts historically marginalized groups. And the idea, again, of ethics, of what we see as right or wrong or important to us. That's something that can come from a lot of experiences, again, such as religious or spiritual views, political or social views, and so on. Shape what we see as important. The second step, right, is that we need to proceed with a responsibility logic rather than a defensive or guilt-oriented logic. In other words, right, oftentimes when we talk about listening, it can feel like we're sort of guilty about it, right? Or we don't feel great about the process of listening. That many of us, including folks who brought this up like in the first week of class, we're saying, you know, I don't feel great as a listener. I don't feel like I'm a good listener. Or, oh, no, I was listening. We oftentimes will use things like pseudo listening to pretend or to fill in on the idea that we are listening, right? And somebody asks, oh, hey, were you listening to me? We'll be like, yes, we were. Or no, sorry, right? So oftentimes we react to a call to listen in a very defensive way. So by responsibility, right, it refers to the idea that we, as part of a society or a group of people, are expected to participate, to engage thoughtfully, to do things that we see as important or contributing to whatever cause that we're part of. For instance, if you're part of a church or local organization, there's a good chance that you're expected to volunteer, right, or to economically contribute or support that organization. If you're a part of a club or activity on campus, right, you have a responsibility to represent Eastern Oregon University when you go to a competition. So we think about listening in a responsible way, and we can think about listening as a sort of duty that we have to do, right? That listening is not something we do because we're trying to defend ourselves and say, oh yeah, I was listening, I was paying attention, but that we listen to learn and to feel like we are acting on what we see as responsible or important for us. And then also the idea, the imperfections do happen as we listen. Nobody is a perfect listener. There are times where we miss a lot of the message. We're not fully paying attention. Think about the presence of things such as psychological noise, physical noise, and so on, right? Those things happen. So our response is not to defend ourselves, but instead to say that we can engage better, or we can think about ways to become more effective listeners in the context of our human limitations. Lastly, and this is the larger one, right? to locate identification in discursive spaces, both commonalities and differences, and to accentuate those differences, not just in claims, but in the cultural logics within which those can be found. So to break this down, you can think back again to what we talked about a little bit earlier with this idea of identification coming from Kenneth Burke, right? That we find other people, we find media that we relate to or that we connect with. And because we find things similar to us, right, we feel persuaded or moved by that. If you have a role model, somebody like a sibling or a person that you really look up to, like an athlete, and you see that person as who you want to be, you find a lot in common with that person. One phenomenon that's been really interesting has been to follow the use of things such as TikTok, right, where people are able to find videos, and find people that share similar ideas or challenges or experiences to that we're persuaded by people who use social media and so on that relate to us, right? So if that's true, identification matters in terms of establishing what's similar and different. Those similarities and differences that we share with other people are not just about what we say. They're not just about our claims or the things that we talk about. For instance, maybe a cultural difference that you and another person have is in your belief in faith or religious orientation. It's not just that that person says, I believe in life after death. It's that culture and identity has shaped the way that you all might approach that differently. That things, again, such as religious or spiritual background, have impacted how you might arrive differently at that question. Given that, right, then the important question that emerges is, why do we listen the way that we do? For instance, I have a good friend of mine who oftentimes will cut off or interrupt people while they're speaking. And we actually talked about that and talked about how it was weird or maybe felt uncomfortable that person, that my friend was always cutting off conversations. Here's what we learned from that process, is that my friend came from a really big family. There were a ton of people talking at all times. Conversations didn't so much continue as much as they started somewhere else, right? And so her experience was that it was very active and loud, and her cultural background and upbringing were focused on this kind of constant interruption and banter. I grew up in a very small family, so as a result, when people talked, there was a lot more space for people to listen, and it was a lot more slow and methodical, to the point where sometimes it could get boring. So that difference helped us to understand some of the ways that we listen. So if we, again, kind of unpack and think about these different elements together, right, these three key steps, we know who we are and who other people are. We know where they're coming from in terms of political, social issues. We think about responsibility, that we have a responsibility to be good listeners, rather than responsibility being a, no, you gotta listen. And we also can think about how identification impacts the listening process, that the similarities and differences we find with other people that we listen to come pretty substantially from the ways that our culture and background impacts us. So given some of the things that we've been talking about and addressing so far in the class, what I'd like you to do is to find a partnership or a group of three. You can have one person in that partnership or group of three, right or tie. And I'd like you to think about these three things. First of all, I want you to pick a form of listening that we've discussed so far. So we've talked about active listening, empathetic listening, critical listening, as three main examples. How might this be similar to this idea of rhetorical listening that we've been developing in class? How would this form that you've chosen be different from rhetorical listening? And then lastly, I want you to think about and to brainstorm in your group how rhetorical listening can help you to make sense of or to think about a message in greater detail. So I'll give you some time to do that. For folks on Zoom, I'm going to split you all into two partnerships. So I'll assign you there. Yes, take some time to explore and to think about this and the ways that we can engage in with this.
I'm sorry. Okay,
It's similar to. But it's different.
Yeah, kind of. You have to show the first and show listening to a different message. Which one is back to the front.
yeah, and like with the identification for like finding ways that you perceive to the other person to listen better. I guess.
Yeah. That's been the different. Empathetic is more like just trying to. Yeah, it says involved use of persuasion is one. Like one, and then one of us. Yourself. The other one, you try to. Yeah, get them to do something.
Yes.
It's literally all. You It's almost like these ones.
Yeah.
It's different in that regard, because active listening seems to be more like you're trying to get them, or you're trying to show understanding of what you're saying. So there's not much of an emphasis actually digital.
Right. That makes sense.
The direct type of greater understanding.
Totally. I read that earlier. Yourself. One of like the important. Yeah.
I think a large part of it is like, it's recognition of thinking about like, where another person is coming from, what the characteristics will be. So I think
And use the understanding
for how to
person
kind of break it down into the whole,
Like being able to like understand like through. It'd be more like. Yeah. Calm, more relaxed. If you were like talking the lines.
Give you about three more minutes or so. You need to think about this.
So put it on this side, then let this side blank. So. Right. Then I wrote on this side, or I wrote on this back side. So I can use it.
There's subject.
You know, I get on.
Is there anything else you want to add? Okay.
Yeah.
That was the last, first one. Yeah. Yeah. You'll probably have it close.
Go ahead and wrap up the current thought or idea you're working on. Make sure you have everybody in your partnership, or group of three, written down. So this time around, I'm not gonna force you to share because I know we're still kind of developing and thinking about what rhetorical listening is and what makes it unique from some of the other ways of listening. And we'll be doing some more sharing and discussion as a group on Friday. But again, we're kind of dipping our toes and thinking about this idea. Had some folks talk about some of the listening forms. I heard some of the discussions related to the ways that, for instance, things such as critical listening, right, are very listener focused on understanding or making sense of the message. Empathetic listening is really focused on the needs or concerns of the speaker. Rhetorical listening, as folks brought up, I think pretty well, is really about trying to understand the why or the background behind the person. Who is that person, and why are they giving the message that they are? Who am I, and what am I paying attention to as I'm listening to somebody else, right? For instance, if you're a member of a different culture, a gesture could mean something really different. There are some cultures where shaking your head means yes and nodding means no, right? So that can be an important element of how we make sense of conversations. It's how we interpret verbal and nonverbal cues. So to wrap up for today, we talked about, again, rhetorical listening, what it is, got into some challenging topics related to that. Again, this is an opportunity for us to think about, to explore, to push back against some of these ideas. Talked about the benefits, right? The rhetorical listening helps us to think about the role that responsibility connects to, and also helps us to think about how culture impacts the listening process. So next class, we'll discuss some applications and challenges, and ways that we can use rhetorical listening a bit more, and talk about those ideas in class. So go ahead and pass forward or email me your prompt for today. Have a great afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you again on Friday.